Hi, I'm Margaret Bearman, and I'm delighted to be talking with you today about designing the digital into higher education assessment. I'm from the Centre for Research and Assessment in Digital Learning at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia, and I'm talking to you today from the lands of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and I'd like to acknowledge this as their country and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge in a slightly different way my colleagues Yuso Niemanen from the University of Hong Kong and Rolla Ajawi, also from Cradle Deakin University, as co-conspirators in this work. So a lot of the time when we talk about the digital in assessment, we're thinking of e-assessment. And e-assessment can be defined very broadly. For example, as a digital mediation of end-to-end assessment process at any point, from the perspective of learners, tutors, learning establishments, awarding bodies and regulators, and the general public. And if you take this broad view of e-assessment, then almost everything is e-assessment now. And I think that's true. Every time we record a grade, it goes up in a digital repository. Most tasks, certainly in Australia, are mediated via the learning management system. Comments, marks are often returned via the learning management system. We communicate with tutors, with lecturers via email, all around these assessment and feedback processes. So everything has a piece of the E in it. In other words, we live in a digital world and the digital is everyday and pervasive. And it's as true for assessment as it is for anything else. And our argument is that authentic higher education assessments should reflect this digital world. And for the most part, they don't entirely. And I think one of the reasons for that is sometimes the digital and the assessment have separate literatures. So what we were seeking to do when we designed a framework was to bring together the assessment and educational technology literatures to make a framework about how to design the digital into assessment. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And we suggest there are three purposes for designing the digital into assessment. And these three purposes can all be employed within a single assessment design, or one assessment design might just look at one or two of them. And these three purposes are to use the digital as a tool to improve assessment, to use assessment to build digital literacies, and to use assessment to build and to credential human capabilities, uniquely human capabilities necessary for working with the digital. So I'm going to talk about each of these three purposes one by one. The first purpose is digital tools. This is the world of e-assessment. You have some form of exciting digital innovation and you use it to improve assessment or assessment processes. It might be employing an e-portfolio. I think someone might be talking about that later. Or using a wiki, or designing assessment using social media. In all these instances, the aim is to use the digital as a tool to improve assessment. And when you do this, employ this purpose, we suggest that it's worth asking yourself three questions. Firstly, how does the use of the digital tool align with the overall assessment rationale? By assessment rationale, we mean assessment for learning, assessment of learning, or sustainable assessment, say assessment as learning. Is the digital here to make sure the assessment is more reliable and valid and making it cheat-proof? Or perhaps the digital is there to ensure that the student can deeply learn the material. Slightly different purposes for the assessment and slightly different purposes for the digital. The next question is, how does the digital tool enhance the assessment design? So sometimes we see the use of the digital not really making much of a difference. It might make it a little bit easier, a little bit more efficient, but essentially the task remains the same. But on the other hand, we can employ the digital, and some of the examples I just gave, e-portfolios, wikis, allow activities that were not previously possible. An e-portfolio allows curation of artefacts in ways that were much more difficult and in fact in some ways impossible using analogue processes. And finally, the third question to ask is, what are the potentially negative effects associated with the digital? Sometimes digital innovation is always presented as a positive project. Almost any form of tool comes with benefits and constraints, and sometimes the negatives outweigh the positives, and sometimes those negative outcomes are unintended, which means you only see them once they're in use, and then you start to realise, that drop-down menu, instead of making things easier, is actually preventing students from exploring things in a more generative way. So the next purpose is using assessment to credential and promote digital literacies. So Rolla and Yuso and I have been doing a literature review about technology and authentic assessment. And one of the things we've been noticing is that sometimes there's a belief that providing technology as a tool to the students, like asking them to do a wiki or to put together an e-portfolio, somehow or other the students will osmotically develop digital literacies. And we would like to suggest that we don't think this is the case, that we think that educators should explicitly consider how their assessment tasks should promote and credential digital literacies, and moreover, if they're going to promote and credential digital literacies, it ought to be integrated into the curriculum. We can't expect our students just to pick up the digital by doing with it. And this is in two forms, digital literacies. This is the everyday digital skills, how to use video or how to write a Twitter post. But then there's the other sorts of things, which are critical insights. So you can teach someone how to use Twitter, but you can also ask them to think critically about Twitter's limitations, about how it can be problematic, about the use of the digital as a surveillance technique, at the same time as teaching people mastery of the digital tools. So in these ways, we think that assessment has a big role to play in really helping our students not just use the technologies, but really come to deeply understand them in a way that a graduate should, I think, in this contemporary time. The third purpose, slightly different again, is promoting and credentialing human capabilities for a digital world. What do I mean by this? I mean the unique capabilities required, uniquely human capabilities required to work with the digital. So this comes from the argument that computers are really, really good at many things. They're much better at calculations, at working at speed, at scale. They don't get tired. Their pattern recognition is beyond comprehension. But there's some things it doesn't do well. They don't do well. For example, creativity or setting standards or designing and explaining and teaching. These are things that perhaps humans are better at. And if so, we should have assessments that specifically promote these capabilities and I think specifically articulate that they're necessary for the digital world. So in conclusion, we're really asking assessment designers to think beyond innovation. We're asking the question, how can we design the digital into assessment to align with a contemporary digitally mediated society? If we hold to the premise that our assessments should reflect the world that we live in, then the digital has to be within it in every way in terms of being a tool, in terms of the skills and capabilities that it's promoting. And I'm going to end with a shameless plug. This is a paper where this framework is explicated. It's just out in Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education. And I'd love to know what you think of it. So I hope you found this talk useful and enjoy the rest of the webinar.